This story of the Devika is one of profound hardship and resilience. She was married at the young age of 15, only to find herself with an alcoholic and abusive husband who treated her mercilessly, often beating her like an animal. The extent of his cruelty became unbearable when, just a week after the birth of their third child, he broke her hand because she refused his demands for intimacy. To add to her suffering, Devika's husband and his family turned against her when she reported their depraved behavior toward her two young children. She couldn't tolerate the abuse her daughter faced, so she went to the police, hoping for justice. However, her encounter with the intimidating police and legal system left her so frightened that she contemplated suicide. But her elderly father and three innocent children kept her from taking her own life. Let's delve deeper into Devika's harrowing journey.
Devika was married at 15, entering a household where her in-laws were present, but her relationship with her husband was tumultuous from the beginning. She was so young and naive, and when she tried to explain her situation, others told her, "He's your husband. Fights will happen. He might even slap you." She resigned herself to this life, hoping things would change. Early into her marriage, she became pregnant. A son was born, then a second child, and finally a third. Meanwhile, her husband's drinking continued, accompanied by arguments and fights she could barely understand at her young age. Within just a few years, at the age of 18, Devika was already a mother of two, bearing not only children but also the weight of her husband's abuse. As the children grew, she tolerated her husband's temper, hoping he might eventually change. However, he was adamant about wanting only sons. When Devika was expecting her third child, he told her bluntly, "If you don't give me a son, I'll leave you." Devika, with nowhere else to go, replied, "Fine, I'll give you a son." She prayed fervently for a boy, fearful that if she gave birth to a girl, her husband would abandon her and their young family. She was only in her early 20s, burdened by responsibilities and an abusive marriage, and came from a poor family where her father, a rickshaw driver, already had 3 daughters to support. The third child, a son, was born after a challenging labor that almost cost her life. But even with this desired child, her husband's behavior didn't improve. She endured relentless beatings, especially after childbirth, often subjected to crude and degrading acts that she didn't understand at her young age. When she turned to her family for support, they dismissed her, saying, "If you eat his food, you have to make him happy." Devika felt trapped in a nightmare that wouldn't end. Her husband beat her mercilessly just a week after she'd given birth, all because she refused to meet his demands on intimacy. She began to wonder if being born a girl was indeed a curse, as her mother-in-law had told her. The cycle of abuse seemed endless. He would beat her whether she complied or not, drank or not, and she was left wondering how much longer she could bear it. As time passed, Devika's children grew a bit older. Her youngest son was 2 or 3 years old, her daughter had matured a little, and her eldest son was beginning to understand more about the world. Although she and her husband continued to live separately, he occasionally returned to her, bringing new struggles and hardships. Devika, needing to provide for her children, found a small room to rent near her parental home and settled there with her children. Her mother-in-law offered limited support, but Devika still had to take care of her family mostly alone. She recalls a day in December, specifically December 17, 2014, when her husband convinced her to return to their family home, claiming he had built a new room on the 4th floor, where they could live peacefully. However, when Devika and her children arrived, she discovered the room was incomplete, with only a tarp over an open frame. There were no solid walls or flooring. The floor was covered in mud, and stray dogs roamed the area. Her husband's promises were all lies, and despite these dire conditions, she did her best to make the space livable. She spread a thick black tarp overhead, hoping it would shield them from rain, and arranged bricks to hold wooden planks, creating a makeshift bed for her and the children. Meanwhile, Devika's husband still didn't work, which meant their finances were always tight. To earn some income, Devika took a job with a nearby company, leaving her youngest child in the care of family members. Her minimal wages barely covered essentials, but it was enough to prevent the children from going hungry. Despite the immense challenges, she continued to hope that things might improve. Sadly, Devika's husband became increasingly violent. One day he broke her hand in a fit of rage, angry simply because she was working to support the family. She managed to go to a trauma center alone for treatment, where her elder brother-in-law accompanied her. When she returned with her hand in a cast, her husband accused her of having an affair with his brother, despite knowing he'd only come as a supportive family member. Just a week later, her husband threatened to break her leg during another argument. Devika's mother-in-law tried to intervene and, in the process, fell from the bed, fracturing her left leg. Despite her age, she suffered this injury while trying to protect her daughter-in-law. With her arm still in a cast, Devika's mother took her back to her family home to recover. Meanwhile, her mother-in-law, unable to care for herself, was taken to Lady Hardinge Hospital, where she was admitted for surgery on her fractured leg. Despite her own injuries, Devika stayed with her mother-in-law, feeling a bond with her as she would with her own mother. She helped with her care, staying with her for nearly 3 months, from January to March during her recovery. When Devika finally returned home in April, her heart sank at the sight of her children. They had been left alone with her sister-in-law and a 25-year-old relative, who stayed in the house while she was away. She'd only occasionally been able to visit her children, and upon her return, she was devastated to learn how they'd been treated. Devika's hope and trust in her family had been shattered, and her story of survival only seemed to deepen. As she was giving bath to her daughter, she noticed some swelling on her private part. Concerned, she asked her daughter if her father had done something to her. The 6-year-old quickly denied it, saying, "No, Mom, stop." This incident sparked intense anger within her, stemming from the daily abuse she endured from her husband. Each morning, she walked 5 kilometers on foot for her work, exhausting herself, and sometimes she would lose her temper with the children. She tried to ignore these feelings, thinking it might just be her imagination, and continued with her life. One Sunday, she took her 2 younger children, a daughter and a son, to her brother-in-law's house. Her elder son stayed back home. In her absence, something terrible happened. Her brother-in-law's 14-year-old son committed an atrocious act against her 8-year-old son, who was left home that day. When she returned home, he told her what had happened. Showing her evidence on his phone, she was filled with rage. How could this happen? She thought, overwhelmed by anger and disbelief. She confronted her brother-in-law, explaining the situation, and also informed her sister-in-law. However, no one believed her. They dismissed it as typical childish behavior. Her son had always been very open and clear about his feelings, but still, no one took him seriously. When she went upstairs to her brother-in-law's son's room, she found the horrific truth to be real. Her brother-in-law slapped his son for his actions, but to her, that was not enough. She thought, "This is a matter for the family. It's just a child's mistake." Her understanding of the situation wasn't fully formed. She had not grasped the severity of what had happened. Yet, as she climbed the 4 flights of stairs back to her home, her son revealed, "Mom, this happened to me. And the uncle and older brother do this all the Minnie." Minnie is an imaginary name of her 6-year daughter. Those words hit her like a ton of bricks. She felt crushed, devastated. She struggled to make it up the stairs, beating her fists against her head in despair. Upon reaching her daughter, she asked if it was true, and her daughter confirmed, "Yes, Mommy, the uncle and older brother do that." The reality of the situation was unbearable for her. Her younger brother-in-law and elder brother-in-law's son had been committing such acts for years. Night after night, she confronted her husband, calling her family together to demand justice. "I want justice for my children," she cried. Her younger brother-in-law was not home, but she insisted on being heard. "I don't care if this is a family issue. My children are suffering." Her husband, however, only said, "This is a family matter. Why do you want to leave the family?" No one supported her. Everyone was more concerned about their reputation than her children's safety. She felt isolated and desperate. After witnessing her children's pain, her heart ached. How could she protect them? She was at a loss for what to do. Then she called a women's support group, explaining everything that had happened. They assured her, saying, "Don't worry. What do you want?" She replied, "I want justice for my daughter." That night, she slept in turmoil, filled with sadness and fear. The next day, as she prepared to drop her children off at school and daycare and left for her work, she forgot the conversation with Women Help Group, but at around 10 o'clock she received a call. "Madam, where are you?" they asked. "I'm at work," she replied. "Get the kids and come home," they insisted. She went to school and told her teacher about the incident. The teacher instructed her to quickly take the children home. By the time she reached home and called for help, 12 police cars had already arrived. Everything had happened before she got there, and her entire neighborhood was filled with people trying to understand what had happened. Everyone kept saying that this would bring shame, and no one would want to marry her, a 6-year-old daughter. How could she think about marriage when such terrible things had happened to her? Despite the fear and judgment, she did not care about what others thought. She followed the legal procedures and was immediately taken to the hospital. Upon arriving at the hospital, the doctors asked if she wanted to provide testimony or if they should conduct internal examinations. She insisted that the doctors perform the internal tests, saying, "This is a matter of someone's life. If my daughter is okay or if my luck is good, she will survive. But no one should be punished without evidence." People had accused her daughter of lying, saying that her husband had beaten her, which made her accuse her brother-in-law falsely. She thought, why would she make false accusations when those people had not done anything to deserve such allegations? She resolved to fight her own battle in court. When they were admitted, her daughter was dressed in white clothes, and the lawyers asked inappropriate questions that made her uncomfortable. She could only think about how she would talk to her daughter about these matters when she grew up. It was heart-wrenching that she had to face such indecent questions in front of other people. She was left alone. There was no one but the court officials and the law present. She felt entirely abandoned. For 10 days, she remained in the hospital with a police officer assigned to her, making it difficult for her to go to the washroom. They were wary, saying many mothers abandon their children in such situations. She insisted to the doctors, "I am not one of those mothers. I have only one daughter. I will not leave her." During her daughter's operation, there were threats to their safety from her husband, who had been drinking. They had to keep her husband away to ensure they remained safe. They spent 10 days in the hospital without food and water, and she had no money. No one bothered to ask if she was hungry. Everyone was more focused on taking statements. The hospital food was meant for her daughter, and she made sure her child ate while she went without. For 10 days, the concern of shame weighed heavily on her, and she managed to survive. After 10 days, they went to court to testify. The magistrate asked similar questions, and she pleaded with the magistrate, saying, "Please, this testimony should not happen anymore because I do not want my daughter to remember this for the rest of her life." Yet, no one supported her, and she was kept in a room in the hospital filled with clutter and labeled specially. She often found herself in tears, reflecting on how she had spent so many days in such conditions. Her daughter had to be strong, and she encouraged her, saying, "You need to be successful and achieve everything. The law may not have punished him, but you will." She gave her testimony in 2019, a year later, but she learned that the culprit was in jail for this period. With the onset of the pandemic, when she finally testified, she found out he would be released on bail since he had apologized. During the hearing in the court, for the grant of the bail to the culprit, the lawyer then began asking her inappropriate questions about her husband's drinking habits, which left her feeling vulnerable. During the court proceedings, the lawyer accused her of falsely blaming her brother-in-laws because they had issues in their marriage. The other questions asked were so inappropriate that she cried out in the courtroom, "Please don't ask me these things. I have nothing to gain from this. I have never been motivated by money. Don't question me this way." The lawyer insisted that these questions were necessary because they were legitimate for court proceedings. When the hearing for granting the bail to the culprit, that is her younger brother-in-laws, was going on, she felt overwhelmed and cried, "If he stays here, I won't be able to testify." She was so distraught that she wanted to harm him for what he had done to her daughter. They agreed to remove him from the courtroom, as her anger was palpable. After the removal, she was questioned again and was told that she needed to control her emotions while testifying. She complied and gave her statement, but afterward, he was still granted bail. Her in-laws were present at the court to secure his release. Her husband must have been there as well, even though she didn't see him. She had a duty to fulfill that evening. She worked as a taxi driver, picking up passengers from Cyber City, and was ready for her shift. She thought that once she finished testifying, she would be free to leave. However, when she found out culprit, the younger uncle of her daughter, was released, she was so distraught that she nearly jumped from the 3rd floor of the courthouse. Thankfully, she was stopped by those around her, including the police, who comforted her. She explained to them, "I have quietly waited for 2 years in this court for justice. Now that it is here, he just asked for forgiveness. For 2 to 3 months he abused my daughter. And now they think an apology is enough." She felt like she was going insane, desperate because he faced no consequences. They had lost their home, and it was made clear that they could not leave India until the case was resolved. While she suffered, he seemed to thrive in jail, gaining weight and appearing healthier. The thought crossed her mind that if someone was to be punished by death, she could take matters into her own hands. A police officer tried to reason with her, saying, "You are such a brave girl to have come this far. If you give up, what will happen to your children?" She replied, "No one will help them while I'm alive. When I'm gone, organizations will come forward, but no one understands my pain right now." His words struck a chord with her, and she decided to go home. However, the officer didn't leave her alone. He kept her close, fearing she might harm herself. He asked her father to come quickly to the station for her safety. Finally, when her father arrived, he wrote an application stating that if anything happened to her, he would take responsibility. From that moment, she decided to let go of her thoughts of dying, especially since her husband had left her in 2018. After leaving home with 3 children, I returned to my parental home at night. From there, I didn't know what to do. However, relatives weren't much help. My sister-in-law, who was my close relative, did a little to help, but I started feeling like a burden. I had 3 kids and I was scared to feed them. They wouldn't refuse to eat, but I felt an inner fear. I was also in training, learning how to drive with Azad Foundation. I wasn't educated enough to handle the responsibilities of 3 children. Eventually, I moved from my sister-in-law's house to another sister's house. But her husband misbehaved with me, trying to take advantage. He claimed he would help me and I fell for it, thinking he was a good person. But when he attempted to cross the line, I packed my things and left that place overnight. I found a room for rent for $1,700, even though I had no money. However, seeing my appearance with 3 children, the landlord agreed to let me stay. Meanwhile, my husband was being violent. He would barge in saying, "You won't sleep tonight. I'll give you money." I had already separated from him and couldn't bear the thought of raising my children in that environment. It was unbearable. After a while, I started going to Azad. I had injuries on my shoulders from the abuse and was often in tears, wondering how I had ended up in this situation. Even with 3 children, I kept pushing myself to learn. My husband thought that if I could manage my kids alone, I wouldn't need him. He was cruel and beat me for no reason. During one visit to Azad, my mentor told me that if I could find 5,000, I should just take it and not endure the beatings. I replied, "Why would I take a beating? I didn't have a job at that time." Eventually, my mentor started providing me with a scholarship. I began working and managing my household, and things improved significantly. I even got my driving license after failing 6 times. Finally, on the 7th attempt, I passed. With my newfound skills, I was able to rent a decent room with my earnings. I enrolled my children in tuition classes, and I felt a great sense of joy knowing I could provide for them. I bought a phone for my children and they were very happy. I had faced many hardships that I couldn't even put into words. One day, the Delhi government announced free heavy vehicle licenses for women. The private heavy vehicle licenses would normally cost around $121,000, which I could never afford. But I spoke up at work and the other women encouraged me. Our supervisor agreed to help. We worked night shifts, allowing us to attend training during the day. I successfully obtained my heavy vehicle license and began working as a driver. Everything started falling into place. No further obstacles arose. I was managing both jobs efficiently. After a 2-month training period in Nan Nagri, I had to leave my job temporarily but managed to earn $12,000 during training. My children began to believe in me. They saw that I could take charge of our lives, similar to how a father would support his family. My children grew excited at the thought of traveling in our own vehicle. They expressed their happiness and pride, and I reassured them that I would bring them home safely. After 2 months of training, I quickly filled out the necessary forms and I was hired. Now I'm doing really well at my job. I aspire to provide a good education for my children and offer them a stable home. I want to care for them like a father would.